"Sir, this is a court of law. Everyone stands." The bailiff's voice boomed across the marble floor of the downtown civic courthouse, its architecture deliberately designed to resemble an ancient Roman forum with towering columns and imposing stonework. Seated in a well-worn, high-backed motorized wheelchair, 84-year-old Tom Delgado looked up slowly from his folded hands, his arthritic fingers gripping the padded armrests with quiet determination. The gallery was completely packed, eager students on an educational field trip, stern-faced HOA board representatives, curious local residents who had heard whispers about this unusual case through neighborhood gossip and social media posts. Judge Armand DeWitt, a methodical man known for his thoroughness, hadn't yet bothered to look up from his imposing stack of legal documents, case precedents, and detailed notes that covered his mahogany desk. No one in that crowded, murmuring courtroom had any idea that the seemingly frail elderly man they were casually staring at had once heroically dragged his severely wounded radio operator out of a burning, smoke-filled Huey helicopter while under intense sniper fire in the dangerous jungles of Vietnam decades ago. His deeply weathered face revealed no war stories, his remarkably quiet demeanor disclosed no past heroics or battlefield courage. He appeared to be just another routine defendant in their indifferent eyes, another mundane problem to be efficiently processed through the judicial system. But beneath that deceptively calm exterior lay decades of distinguished military service, tremendous personal sacrifice, and a simple heartfelt desire to tend a small therapeutic garden that helped keep his precious memories of fallen brothers gloriously alive. The impatient bailiff waited with obvious annoyance, rhythmically tapping his polished black shoe against the courthouse's gleaming floor, remaining completely unaware of the truly remarkable man he was so curtly addressing. Tom Delgado was barely 22 years old when the military draft pulled him straight out of a junior seminary in the dusty hills of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he had been studying to become a Catholic priest. He had spent his teenage years dreaming of becoming a literature teacher instead, imagining himself standing before eager students discussing the profound works of John Steinbeck and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, sharing the transformative beauty of storytelling and the remarkable power of carefully chosen words to change hearts, minds, and entire worldviews. Those innocent dreams seemed so distant now, like forgotten pages from a beloved book he'd never have the chance to finish reading. Vietnam changed absolutely everything in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined during those peaceful, contemplative seminary days filled with prayer, study, and quiet reflection. As a forward observer stationed in the dangerous, unforgiving jungle highlands of Southeast Asia, Tom survived not one but two absolutely brutal enemy ambushes that left many of his closest brothers dead or dying in agony around him in the thick, suffocating mud. The vivid, traumatic memories of those terrifying firefights still haunted his restless dreams decades later, the deafening screaming of wounded men, the choking black smoke from burning equipment, the desperate, frantic calls for medical evacuation helicopters that sometimes arrived too late to save lives. It was during his third grueling deployment that Tom tragically lost both of his legs below the knee to a carefully hidden buried explosive device while courageously attempting to extract two severely wounded fellow soldiers from a deadly enemy kill zone under heavy automatic weapons fire. The field medics who treated him said he was incredibly lucky to survive the devastating blast at all, considering the massive trauma and blood loss. He received both a Bronze Star for exceptional valor under fire and a Purple Heart for his combat wounds, but Tom never liked to mention those military decorations to anyone, keeping them carefully locked away in a small wooden box in his bedroom closet where they gathered dust. After the war finally ended and he returned home to New Mexico, Tom painstakingly built prosthetic devices into his daily routine and slowly learned to navigate the challenging world on artificial limbs that never quite felt natural. He married his devoted high school sweetheart, Maria Elena Sandoval, and together they raised three beautiful, intelligent daughters who grew up thinking their father was the strongest, bravest man in the entire world. For nearly 4 decades, Tom successfully operated a modest but genuinely beloved independent bookstore called Delgado's Pages, in historic downtown Santa Fe, where he finally got to share his deep, abiding love of literature with loyal customers who became like extended family to him over the years. The cozy store was filled with carefully curated books, comfortable reading chairs, and the wonderful smell of fresh coffee that Maria brewed every single morning before opening. But when massive online retailers like Amazon began ruthlessly dominating the book market, Tom was eventually forced to close his doors forever, ending a chapter of his life. Now a lonely widower after losing his beloved Maria to a long, painful battle with cancer 3 years ago, he spent his quiet, solitary days tending a small but deeply meaningful memorial garden of traditional sage, colorful peppers, and native squash behind his modest duplex home. A deeply personal ritual of healing and remembrance that connected him to both his rich cultural heritage and his fallen comrades who never returned from that distant war. The garden was his sacred sanctuary, his daily therapy, his quiet way of honoring those brave souls who never made it home alive. Each plant he carefully tended was like a whispered prayer, each small harvest a joyful celebration of life continuing despite devastating loss. In the early morning hours, Tom would will himself out among the vegetables, talking softly to his plants as if they were old friends who understood his pain. The garden gave him purpose when everything else seemed meaningless, hope when grief threatened to overwhelm him completely. It was more than just vegetables growing in rich soil, it was his connection to the living world, his proof that beauty could still emerge from the darkest earth. But Tom had no idea that this simple, meaningful act of heartfelt remembrance would soon bring him face to face with a cold, bureaucratic system that neither understood nor honored what his humble garden truly represented to him and his community. The legal battle that awaited him would test everything he believed about justice, dignity, and the right to remember fallen heroes in his own way. What seemed like a simple neighborhood dispute would become something much larger, a fight for the soul of remembrance itself. A neighbor's petty complaint led the gated community's homeowners association to declare Tom's small memorial garden officially non-compliant with their strict aesthetic guidelines and property regulations. Despite Tom's respectful appeals and detailed explanations about the garden's deep personal significance, the 5-member HOA board absolutely refused to make any reasonable accommodation for his situation. The board consisted of retired suburbanites who had never served in the military and seemed incapable of understanding why anyone would want to grow vegetables instead of maintaining a perfectly manicured lawn like everyone else in the development. When Tom courageously cited his documented PTSD diagnosis and his psychological reliance on therapeutic gardening as prescribed by his VA counselor, they responded with cold bureaucratic efficiency by issuing a formal notice of violation that threatened legal action if he didn't immediately remove every single plant. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official language making it clear that the HOA considered his garden nothing more than an unsightly nuisance that decreased property values and violated community standards. Board President Margaret Hensley, a stern woman in her 70s who had moved to New Mexico from Connecticut after her husband's retirement, personally visited Tom's duplex to deliver the ultimatum in person. She stood on his front porch wearing designer sunglasses and expensive jewelry, looking down at him with undisguised disdain as he sat in his wheelchair trying to explain the garden's importance to his mental health and healing process. "Mr. Delgado," she said in a voice dripping with condescension, "we all have our little hobbies and interests, but rules are rules for everyone in this community. No exceptions can be made, regardless of your personal circumstances or feelings about the matter." When Tom quietly asked if they might consider a compromise, perhaps allowing him to screen the garden with attractive fencing or relocate it to a less visible area of his property, Hensley shook her head firmly and tapped the violation notice with one perfectly manicured fingernail. "The community covenants are very clear about landscaping requirements," she continued, her tone becoming increasingly harsh and unsympathetic. "Vegetable gardens, memorial plantings, and non-decorative vegetation are explicitly prohibited in all residential areas without exception. You have exactly 30 days to bring your property into full compliance, or we will be forced to pursue legal remedies through the courts." Refusing to abandon the plants that had become his lifeline to sanity and peace, Tom made the difficult decision to fight the HOA's demands, knowing that his modest veteran's pension could barely cover basic living expenses, let alone expensive legal fees. He was eventually summoned to appear in municipal court, where a bailiff named Officer Carmichael, a man in his 40s who had never served overseas, saw Tom as just another difficult defendant trying to game the system with sob stories and excuses. As the contentious hearing began in the packed courtroom, Tom tried his best to explain to anyone who would listen that his legs had been completely amputated below the knee during combat operations in Vietnam, making it physically impossible for him to stand for extended periods as courthouse protocol demanded. But Carmichael interrupted him with obvious skepticism and barely concealed irritation, rolling his eyes as he spoke. "Look, buddy, lots of people exaggerate their disabilities and medical conditions to get special treatment," he said loudly enough for the entire gallery to hear his dismissive words. "I've been working in this courthouse for over 15 years, and I've seen it all before. Everyone thinks they deserve a free pass or special consideration for something." The crowded gallery stirred uncomfortably at the bailiff's harsh words, with some spectators beginning to whisper among themselves about the obvious unfairness of the situation. Several people in the back rows scoffed audibly at Tom's claims, while one middle-aged man in an expensive business suit muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Everyone wants a convenient loophole these days. Nobody wants to follow the same rules as everybody else." The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense and hostile as more spectators began taking sides, some supporting the HOA's position while others quietly sympathized with the elderly veteran's plight. Tom sat silently in his wheelchair, his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching as his dignity was stripped away piece by piece in front of strangers who knew nothing about his service or sacrifice. The HOA's attorney stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, shuffling through documents that would paint Tom as a stubborn rule-breaker who refused to respect community standards. Judge Armand DeWitt was a stoic and methodical man in his early 60s who had presided over hundreds of civil cases involving housing disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and homeowners association violations during his distinguished 15-year career on the municipal bench. He was known throughout the legal community for his careful attention to detail, his unwavering commitment to fairness, and his ability to cut through emotional arguments to find the heart of legal matters. But as he sat at his elevated bench that morning, slowly skimming through Tom Delgado's thick case file with growing interest, something about this particular dispute began to feel fundamentally different from the routine HOA enforcement actions he typically handled. The documentation was extensive and telling. Detailed military service records spanning multiple combat deployments, comprehensive VA psychological evaluations documenting severe PTSD and chronic depression, prescriptions for therapeutic gardening activities as part of his ongoing treatment plan, and dozens of heartfelt letters of community support from neighbors, fellow veterans, and local religious leaders who vouched for Tom's character and the garden's positive impact on his mental health. Judge DeWitt found himself pausing frequently as he read, highlighting key passages with his yellow marker and making careful notes in the margins of the legal briefs. The measured, respectful tone of Tom's legal documentation stood in stark contrast to the HOA's aggressive, uncompromising stance, and something about Tom's quiet stillness in the courtroom felt profoundly different from the usual parade of angry defendants who appeared before his bench. The veteran sat motionless in his wheelchair, his hands folded peacefully in his lap, his eyes neither pleading nor defiant, just deeply, unmistakably tired. There was a dignity in his silence that spoke louder than any impassioned legal argument, a weight of experience that seemed to fill the space around him. Judge DeWitt had seen thousands of people in his courtroom over the years, angry homeowners, entitled HOA board members, scheming landlords, desperate tenants, but rarely had he encountered someone who carried themselves with such quiet grace under pressure. As the noise and tension in the gallery continued to escalate around heated discussions of property rights and community standards, Judge DeWitt found himself studying Tom's weathered face more carefully, noting the way the old man's eyes seemed to look through the chaos rather than at it, as if he had witnessed far worse things than a contentious civil hearing. The judge began to sense that there were layers to this story that the legal documents couldn't fully capture, depths of experience and sacrifice that the sterile language of HOA covenants and municipal ordinances could never adequately address. Something about the way Tom held himself, with neither bitterness nor self-pity, but with the quiet endurance of someone who had learned to carry heavy burdens without complaint, made Judge DeWitt pause and reconsider everything he thought he understood about this case. This wasn't just another petty neighborhood dispute over landscaping regulations and property values. This was something far more significant, something that touched on fundamental questions of respect, dignity, and what it truly meant to honor those who had served their country. As the courtroom noise reached a crescendo of competing voices and heated opinions, Judge DeWitt found himself looking not at the legal briefs before him, but directly into Tom Delgado's calm, patient eyes, searching for the story that lay beneath the surface of this seemingly simple civil matter. In that moment of unexpected connection across the formal distance of the courtroom, Judge DeWitt began to understand that he was not merely presiding over a routine property dispute, but witnessing something that would challenge his understanding of justice itself. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he realized that his decision would determine not just the fate of a small garden, but the dignity of a man who had already given more than most people could imagine. The judge's years of legal training had taught him to rely on precedent, procedure, and the letter of the law, but something deeper was stirring within him, a recognition that true justice sometimes required looking beyond the written rules to see the human heart of a matter. As he prepared to make his ruling, Judge DeWitt found himself thinking not about HOA covenants or municipal codes, but about what it meant to stand for something greater than oneself, and what society owed to those who had already stood when it mattered most. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, a moment suspended between rigid adherence to bureaucratic rules and the higher calling of human compassion and understanding. As the courtroom noise escalated to an almost unbearable level with heated arguments and competing voices filling the air, Judge Armand DeWitt suddenly raised his weathered hand high above his head and stood up slowly from his imposing judicial bench with deliberate, measured movements. The authority in his gesture was unmistakable and immediate, causing the chaotic din to gradually subside into uncertain murmurs and then complete, expectant silence. "Officer Carmichael, please step back from the defendant immediately," he commanded in a firm, clear voice that brooked no argument or hesitation. The bailiff blinked in obvious confusion and surprise, his face flushing red with embarrassment as he realized he was being publicly corrected by the judge in front of the entire packed courtroom. Without another word of explanation or legal preamble, Judge DeWitt came down from his elevated bench and walked slowly, purposefully across the marble floor toward Tom's wheelchair, his black robes flowing behind him like the wings of some ancient bird of justice. The entire gallery watched in stunned silence, unsure of what they were witnessing, as this unexpected departure from normal courtroom protocol unfolded before their eyes. The judge did not speak at first as he approached the elderly veteran, taking time to study Tom's face with genuine compassion and growing understanding. Then, in a quiet voice filled with respect and barely controlled emotion, Judge DeWitt spoke words that would echo through that courtroom for years to come. "Mr. Delgado, I see you now. I see who you really are and what you've done for this country. And I'm deeply, profoundly sorry that we didn't see you sooner, that we didn't recognize your service and sacrifice from the very beginning of these proceedings." The judge's voice grew stronger and more certain as he continued, his words carrying the weight of moral authority and hard-earned wisdom. "You have already stood for this country in ways that most of us will never fully understand or appreciate, long before any of us in this room were ever asked to make such sacrifices." Without any ceremony or hesitation, Judge DeWitt slowly, deliberately knelt down beside Tom's wheelchair, bringing himself to eye level with the veteran in a gesture of profound respect and recognition. His voice carried clearly across the now completely silent courtroom as he said, "Now let us stand for you, as you once stood for all of us." The profound silence that followed was broken only by the sound of shuffling feet as an older veteran in the back row, wearing a faded military cap and medals on his jacket, slowly rose from his seat with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. A middle school teacher who had brought her students on the field trip followed his example, gently encouraging her young charges to stand as well, using this unexpected moment as a powerful lesson about respect and honor. Within what seemed like mere moments, nearly everyone in the packed courtroom was rising to their feet in a spontaneous display of recognition and gratitude. Even Officer Carmichael, his face now pale with the realization of his earlier insensitivity and harsh treatment of a genuine war hero, straightened his shoulders and offered a crisp, respectful military salute, the stiff, formal movements of a man learning an important lesson about dignity and service far too late in life, but learning it nonetheless. The HOA representatives in the front row shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of how petty and small their complaints appeared in the face of such overwhelming recognition of real sacrifice and service. Margaret Hensley, the stern HOA board president who had been so dismissive of Tom's situation, found herself unable to meet anyone's eyes as the weight of her earlier callousness settled heavily upon her conscience. Students in the gallery stood with wide eyes and open mouths, witnessing a profound lesson about honor and respect that no textbook could ever adequately teach. Their teacher quietly wiped away tears as she watched her young students experience this powerful moment of civic education and human decency. Tom himself remained seated in his wheelchair, his weathered hands still folded in his lap, but for the first time since entering the courtroom, his tired eyes showed a glimmer of something that might have been hope, or perhaps simply the quiet satisfaction of finally being seen and understood for who he truly was. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, filled with the weight of recognition, respect, and the collective acknowledgement of a debt that could never be fully repaid. In that sacred moment, the artificial divisions between plaintiff and defendant, authority and citizen, young and old seemed to dissolve completely, replaced by a shared understanding of what it meant to honor those who had sacrificed for the freedom and safety of others. Judge DeWitt remained kneeling beside Tom's wheelchair, his own eyes glistening with emotion as he witnessed the transformation taking place in his courtroom, a space usually defined by conflict and adversarial proceedings suddenly becoming a place of unity, recognition, and human connection. Judge DeWitt rose slowly from his kneeling position beside Tom's wheelchair and returned to his bench with the quiet dignity of a man who had just witnessed something that would change him forever. He gathered his legal documents with deliberate care, his hands steady despite the profound emotion that had just filled the courtroom. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of judicial authority combined with genuine human compassion, creating a moment that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. "This court hereby dismisses all charges against Thomas Delgado," he announced clearly, his words echoing off the marble walls with finality and justice. "After careful review of all evidence and testimony presented here today, this court finds absolutely no violation of any municipal ordinance, community covenant, or reasonable standard of conduct." He paused, allowing the significance of his words to settle over the stunned courtroom before continuing with even greater conviction. "What the plaintiff has characterized as a garden violation, this court recognizes and officially declares to be an act of sacred remembrance, a living memorial to fallen heroes, and a legitimate therapeutic practice prescribed by qualified medical professionals for the treatment of service-connected disabilities." The HOA's attorney shuffled through her papers frantically, clearly unprepared for such a decisive ruling that completely undermined her client's position. Judge DeWitt was far from finished with his judicial pronouncement. "Furthermore, this court orders the Homeowners Association to pay all legal fees, court costs, and attorney expenses incurred by Mr. Delgado in defending his constitutional rights and his dignity as a disabled veteran." His voice grew stronger as he continued, "The HOA board is also hereby ordered to issue a formal written apology to Mr. Delgado within 30 days, acknowledging their failure to properly accommodate his documented disabilities and their lack of understanding regarding the therapeutic and memorial nature of his garden activities." Margaret Hensley visibly winced at these words, her earlier arrogance completely deflated. Within just a few days of the court ruling, the story of Tom's legal victory had spread throughout the local community and beyond, inspiring an outpouring of support that surprised everyone involved. The city council voted unanimously to designate a large community garden space in Tom's neighborhood as Delgado Grove, officially dedicated to therapeutic gardening specifically for military veterans and their families. Local veterans organizations, church groups, and civic associations rallied together to fund the project, while area nurseries donated plants, tools, and expertise. The grand opening ceremony took place on a bright Saturday morning in late spring, with hundreds of community members gathering to celebrate not just the new garden space, but the principles of respect, recognition, and healing that it represented. Local schoolchildren helped plant the first crops of traditional vegetables, herbs, and native plants, their young hands working alongside weathered veterans who shared stories of service and sacrifice. The children listened with wide eyes as these heroes spoke quietly about brotherhood, loss, and the healing power of working with living things. At the entrance to Delgado Grove, a beautiful bronze plaque was installed, its polished surface catching the morning sunlight as visitors read the carefully chosen words inscribed there, let the living honor the fallen in every green thing that grows. Dedicated to all who served, all who sacrificed, and all who remember. Below this inscription, Tom's own words were etched in smaller letters, in memory of those who stood so that others might kneel in gardens of peace. The memorial garden quickly became a place of pilgrimage for veterans from across the region, a space where they could find solace, community, and purpose in tending to growing things that represented hope, renewal, and the continuation of life despite devastating loss. Every weekend, the garden filled with families, children, and veterans of all ages working together among the raised beds, sharing stories, knowledge, and the quiet companionship that comes from understanding sacrifice. Tom became the unofficial guardian of the space, wheeling himself among the rows each morning to check on the plants and greet visitors with gentle words of encouragement. He established a tradition of holding informal gathering circles every Sunday afternoon, where veterans could share their experiences, their struggles, and their healing journeys with others who truly understood. The garden grew into something far greater than anyone had initially imagined, not just a place to grow vegetables, but a living symbol of how communities could honor their heroes, support healing, and transform conflict into understanding and hope. Tom spoke at the opening of Delgado Grove. His voice was soft but firm. "I've learned that justice isn't loud. It kneels. It listens. And when it stands, it lifts others with it." That day, as families walked between the pepper beds and rosemary, they didn't just see plants, they saw what it meant to be remembered not just for what you suffered, but for how you endured. Justice bloomed.